What's up, class? Welcome to the final reading for our unit on evil and suffering, and how do we as Christians view this issue, and how do we respond to people who use it to challenge the validity and the truth of Christianity. Just a little bit of review. We spent the first section talking about how the traditional argument for the existence of God from evil and suffering doesn't work because it assumes that if we can't think of a good reason for why God would allow evil and suffering, then he can't have any good reasons. And we looked at the no-see-ums analogy that Alvin Plantinga made. And then we looked at how evil and suffering is actually a problem for the unbeliever as well. And the reason why that is because as soon as they get rid of the idea of God, then they lose any sort of absolute or objective standard by which to judge God and what he's doing in allowing evil and suffering. So as soon as you get rid of the authority of God in establishing what is right and wrong and being able to be outraged at something that is wrong, as soon as you get rid of him, you get rid of that standard, and you can no longer really be outraged objectively according to any standard because God is gone. Then we looked at kind of the emotional response to evil and suffering, and how the cross of Jesus Christ, his death itself, and how he experienced more pain and suffering than anyone has ever had. And he did it for us. He did it on the cross for our sins in our place. And if we embrace that, we have tremendous power to get through any horrible suffering that this life throws at us. But now, in this section called Resurrection and Suffering, we're going to be looking at, Tim Keller is going to be addressing how the resurrection of Christ doesn't just help you through suffering, it actually gives you hope that suffering will actually be resolved in the end. That all the heartaches and the suffering and the pain that we go through will be made up for in the end. And it will actually be worth it all. Which is why he says in this first part here, I think we need something more than knowing God is with us in our difficulties. This whole phrase, knowing more than God is with us, this has to do with the previous section when we talked about the cross of Jesus Christ and how the cross of Jesus Christ helps you to know, number one, God isn't punishing you in your suffering because Christ was punished for you on the cross. We can also know that God cares about you and loves you because he proved his love for you and that he suffered and died for you. And that shows you that God is truly with you in your sufferings. But he says, I think we need something more than simply knowing God is with us in our difficulties. He said, so what do we need? We also need hope that our suffering is not in vain, that it actually has a purpose. It's not in vain. It's not purposeless. Right? We all hate doing things in vain. We hate doing things without a purpose. Have you ever noticed how desperate families of lost loved ones are to say that? There was a story back in high school. There was a mother who had two daughters. One was a senior, one was a sophomore. And the oldest one died in a car accident because she wasn't wearing her seatbelt. And so the mother has now established a foundation for encouraging kids to wear their seatbelts because of the loss of her oldest daughter. And the whole point of this mother doing this is because she wants to know, she needs hope that her suffering, and the loss of her daughter was not in vain, that it actually worked out for something good in making seatbelts be a priority for kids. So this is what this woman did. They work to reform laws or change social conditions that led to the death of the person who was lost. They need to believe that death of their loved ones has led to new life, that the injustice has led to greater justice. So the story back when I was in high school, the girl died in a car accident, That is tremendous suffering for the mother and the family. So she started a foundation, right? Because she wanted her suffering to actually work out for a greater purpose. She wanted it to work for a greater purpose. And we all need this. We want this. We want to see the bad things we go through actually lead to something better. For the one who suffers, the Christian faith provides a resource, not just its teaching on the cross. That was the previous section. This is the previous section. But also the fact of the resurrection. So this is the gospel. The gospel is Christ died for our sins, that he also rose again from the dead, conquering Satan, sin, death, and hell. The Bible teaches the future is not an immaterial paradise, but a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 21 is very, very big. We'll be looking at that next class. We do not see human beings being taken out of this world but into heaven, but rather heaven coming down and cleansing and renewing and perfecting this material world. This is the Christian view of things. And then he's going to contrast it with some other things. The secular view of things, of course, sees no future restoration after death or history for the losses and pain of this life and all the joys that might have been. The biblical view of things is resurrection, not a future that is just consolation, like comfort, like the cross comforts us, but it's also restoration of the life you always wanted. This is a really important phrase here. The biblical view of things is resurrection, not a future that is just consolation for the life we never had, but a restoration for the life we've always wanted. This means that every horrible thing that ever happened, will not only be undone and repaired, but will in some way make the eventual glory and joy even greater. I want you to see that. He just said, every horrible thing we go through, according to the Bible, if we believe in the resurrection, will not just undo and repair what was broken, but the suffering itself will actually make the joy of the future new creation on this earth even sweeter had we not gone through it. And he gives an example of this. It's a great example. A few years ago, I had a horrible nightmare. I'm sure you guys can relate to that. In which I dreamed that everyone in my family died. When I awoke, my relief was enormous, but there was much more than just relief. My delight in each member of my family was tremendously enriched. I looked at each one and realized how grateful I was for them, how deeply I loved them. Why? Why is it that when he experienced a nightmare, his love and his appreciation for his family increased? My joy, look at this phrase, my joy had been greatly magnified by the nightmare. His joy had been magnified, intensified by the nightmare. My delight upon awaking took the terror up into itself, as it were, so that in the end, my love for them was only greater for my having lost them and found them again. That's amazing. So he went through a nightmare. My delight upon awaking took the terror up into itself. So whenever you have a nightmare, it's horrible, but as soon as you wake up, it takes the horror and the terror of the nightmare. It sucks it up into the joy that you have of being awake, and it was just a nightmare. So in the end, my love for them was only greater for having lost them. The loss in the nightmare creates a greater love for them and a greater joy for them. This same dynamic. So why is he telling this example? This was an example that he just gave. Why is he telling this example? This same dynamic is at work when you lose some possession you take for granted. When you find it again, having thought it was gone forever, you cherish and appreciate it in a far deeper way. You know about this. I'm sure you guys have experienced this. You really enjoy, it may be like an iPhone, right? You lose your iPhone. You appreciated your iPhone, but then you lose it for a whole week, right? And your parents say you can't buy one, and you can't get a job, and so you can't buy a new one. So they said if you can't find your phone, you're going to get a crummy little flip phone. But then a week later, you find it because you lost your phone and you experienced that pain of losing it. Your love for your phone grew after you found it. Okay, so what's these examples? He used the examples of the nightmare, and he used the example of losing. You lose some possession. I gave the example of the iPhone, right? In Greek, specifically Stoic philosophy, there was a belief that history was an endless cycle. Every so often, the universe would wind down and burn up in a great conflagration called a palingenesia, after which history, having been purified, started over. A palingenesia. Everything starts over. This is the old Greek philosophy. This is the culture in which the Bible began to grow, that the gospel came in. But in Matthew 19:28, Jesus spoke of his return to earth as a palingenesis. I tell you the truth, at the renewal of all things. The renewal of all things. It's the Greek word for palingenesis. The Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne. This was a radically new concept. Jesus insisted that his return will be with such power that the very material world and universe will be purged of all decay and brokenness. All will be healed, and all might have beens will be. All might have beens will be. Basically, what he's saying that this experience of the nightmare and this experience of losing something and the joy you get after it when you find them again and find the lost possession again is very similar to this new creation, this renewal of all things talked about here. You should be familiar with this word there. That in the renewal of all things, Jesus said, it will be very similar to waking up from a nightmare. Just after the climax of the trilogy of The Lord of the Rings, he gives another example from The Lord of the Rings. Sam Gamgee discovers that his friend Gandalf was not dead, as he thought, but alive. He cries, I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? The answer of Christianity to that question, what question? The question of Sam Gamgee. The answer of Christianity to that question is yes. 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 Yes to what? Is everything sad going to come untrue? Yes, it will. Everything sad is going to come untrue, and it will somehow be greater. It will somehow be greater for having once been broken. Broken how? By sin, death, suffering. It will somehow be greater for having once been broken and lost. Embracing the Christian doctrines of the incarnation and cross brings profound consolation. That was the previous section, in the face of suffering. But the doctrine of the resurrection can instill us with a powerful hope. We all need hope. It promises that we will get the life we most long for, but it will be what is it? It is the life we most long for. It will be infinitely more glorious. Why? An infinitely more glorious world than if there had never been the need for bravery, endurance, sacrifice, or salvation. And these things require sin, death, suffering, brokenness. The new creation, the new resurrection, the resurrection of all things, the renewal of everything in this world will be that much greater because of all of the hardship we had gone through in this life. This is a famous quote by Dostoevsky. We'll go over this in class, so I'm just going to read it briefly. I believe he said this about this stuff up here. Dostoevsky, who was an author, he wrote Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov. He said, I believe like a child that suffering will be healed. Suffering will be healed. I love this. I believe like a child, innocently. I have no real evidence for believing it, but it just seems like that's how it should be. I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for. That all the humiliating and absurdity of human contradictions will vanish. Like a pitiful mirage, like the despicable fabrication of the impotent and infinitely small Euclidean mind of man. That in the world's finale, what's that? The palingenesis, the new creation, the renewal of all things, the resurrection. That in the world's finality, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, everyone, for it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify and make sense of all that has happened, including evil and suffering. And C.S. Lewis put it in a similar way. More succinctly, C.S. Lewis wrote, they say of some temporal suffering, no future bliss can make up for it. So some people say this. Some people, C.S. Lewis said that some people say there are some temporal suffering, there's some sufferings today that no future bliss can make up for it. Not knowing, they say this, and they don't know, not knowing that heaven, once attained, will actually work backwards and turn even that agony into a glory. It's beautiful. This is the ultimate defeat of evil. It will not only be ended, but so radically vanquished that what has happened will only serve to make our future life and joy infinitely greater. Basically, that all the suffering and the evil and the brokenness that we experience in life, heaven will one day come to this earth through the great resurrection of Jesus Christ and will actually undo and make up for and restore everything that has been broken. And because we went through the temporary evil and suffering of this life, it will actually work like a nightmare when you wake up from it. It will actually serve to make the joy of the new creation, the palingenesis, the new creation, that much sweeter and infinitely greater. That's the end of the reading. If you guys have any questions, please give me any sort of email that you guys might have. See you guys Thursday. Bye.